The alarm clock buzzed at exactly 5 a.m. in the small military tent. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos opened her eyes and stared at the canvas ceiling above her bed. She had been doing this same routine for 8 months now in Afghanistan. Wake up before sunrise. Check her equipment. Get ready for another day in the desert. Maria rolled out of her narrow cot and put her feet on the cold ground. The air was still chilly from the night before. She could hear other soldiers starting to move around in nearby tents. Someone was already making coffee in the mess area. The smell drifted through the camp like a welcome signal that another day was beginning. She was 25 years old with dark hair that she kept pulled back in a tight bun according to military rules. Maria had joined the army right after high school. Her family thought she was crazy for wanting to be a soldier. Her mother cried for weeks when Maria left for basic training. But Maria always knew she wanted to serve her country and help protect people. Maria walked to the small mirror hanging on a tent pole and looked at herself. Her uniform was clean and pressed. Her boots were polished until they shined like black glass. She took pride in looking professional every single day. Other soldiers respected her because she never let her standards drop even in this difficult place. The radio equipment was her specialty. Maria could work any communication device the Army had. She knew every frequency and every call sign by heart. When soldiers got into trouble and needed help, Maria was the person who connected them to rescue teams or air support. Her voice on the radio meant hope was coming. She picked up her radio gear and checked every piece carefully. The main radio unit was about the size of a briefcase but much heavier. She tested all the buttons and switches. The display screen lit up bright green, showing all systems were working perfectly. She checked the backup battery levels. Full power. She examined every wire and connection. Everything looked good. The handheld emergency radio was clipped to her belt. This smaller device was her lifeline if something happened to the main radio. Maria tested its signal strength and emergency beacon. The red light blinked 3 times, showing it was ready. She had never needed to use it in a real emergency, but she checked it every morning anyway. Her teammates were starting to gather in the briefing tent. Maria grabbed her coffee cup and walked over to join them. The coffee was strong and black, just the way she liked it. The warm liquid helped wake her up completely as the desert sun started to appear over the mountains in the distance. Lieutenant Johnson was studying a map spread out on a folding table. He was young for an officer, maybe only 23 years old, but the soldiers respected him. He always listened to his experienced sergeants like Maria and never tried to prove he was smarter than everyone else. That made him a good leader in a place where mistakes could get people killed. The other soldiers were checking their weapons and gear. There was Johnny Martinez, who always talked about his wife back home. He carried her picture in his helmet and showed it to anyone who would look. Tommy Chen was the youngest in their unit at only 19. He tried to act tough, but Maria could tell he was still scared sometimes. There was also Rodriguez and Williams and about 35 other soldiers, all getting ready for the day. Lieutenant Johnson started the briefing by pointing to the map. Today they would escort a supply convoy through a valley about 20 miles from their base. The route was marked with a red line on the map. It was a road they had traveled many times before without any problems. The local people in that area were friendly and often waved at the American soldiers as they passed by. The convoy would have 8 trucks carrying food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies to a smaller outpost. Deeper in the mountains, 40 soldiers would provide protection riding in armored vehicles. Maria would be in the 3rd truck with her radio equipment ready to call for help if they ran into any trouble. She studied the route carefully. The road wound through a narrow pass between 2 ridges of rocky hills. It was the only way to reach the outpost, so they had no choice but to use this path. Intelligence reports said the area was secure with no enemy activity reported in the past month. Local village leaders had assured the American commanders that the road was safe to travel. Maria felt confident about the mission. She had made this same trip at least 20 times since arriving in Afghanistan. The biggest danger was usually mechanical problems with the trucks or maybe a flat tire from driving over sharp rocks. She had never seen any enemy fighters in this particular valley. The briefing ended with Lieutenant Johnson reminding everyone to stay alert and follow safety procedures. They would leave the base in 1 hour after final equipment checks and vehicle inspections. Maria walked back to her tent to gather the rest of her gear and write a quick email to her family back home. She sat at a small laptop computer connected to the base internet system. The connection was slow, but it worked well enough for basic communication. Maria typed a message to her parents and younger brother telling them she was safe and healthy. She always kept these messages positive and happy. No point in worrying her family about the dangers she faced every day. Her mother had been sending care packages filled with candy bars and magazines and letters from friends. Maria loved getting mail from home. It reminded her that there was a normal world waiting for her when her deployment ended in 4 more months. She was already making plans for what she would do when she got back to the United States. After sending the email, Maria put on her body armor and helmet. The protective vest was heavy and made it hard to move quickly, but it could stop bullets and shrapnel. She adjusted the straps until it fit comfortably over her uniform. The helmet felt familiar on her head after wearing it every day for months. Maria picked up her rifle and checked that it was clean and loaded. She hoped she would never need to use it, but every soldier had to be ready to fight if necessary. The weapon felt solid and reliable in her hands. She had practiced with it so many times that loading and firing had become automatic responses. The sun was getting higher now and the desert was starting to warm up. It would be another hot day with temperatures probably reaching over 100 degrees by afternoon. Maria was used to the heat by now, but she still drank plenty of water and tried to stay in shade whenever possible. She walked toward the convoy vehicles where other soldiers were doing final checks on engines and equipment. The trucks were painted in desert camouflage colors that helped them blend in with the sandy landscape. Each vehicle was equipped with armor plating and reinforced glass to protect against small arms fire. Maria climbed into the third truck and arranged her radio equipment in the passenger seat. She tested the communication link with the base one more time. The signal came through clear and strong. She was ready for another routine mission, escorting supplies to their fellow soldiers in the mountains. Everything seemed perfect that morning. The weather was good. All equipment was working properly. Intelligence reports showed no threats in the area. Maria had no way of knowing that this would be the most important and dangerous day of her entire life. In just a few hours, she would face a choice that would determine whether 40 soldiers lived or died. The convoy rolled out of the base gates at exactly 8 a.m. Maria waved to the guards as they passed through the checkpoint. The morning sun was bright and warm on her face through the open window of the armored truck. She felt good about the day ahead. The driver sitting next to her was Sergeant Mike Thompson, a friendly guy from Texas who always had funny stories to tell. 8 military trucks moved in a careful line down the dusty road. The lead vehicle was filled with soldiers whose job was to watch for dangers ahead. Behind them came trucks loaded with supplies and equipment. Maria rode in the third truck with her radio gear humming quietly beside her. More soldiers followed behind them, ready to protect the convoy from any threats. The landscape around them was beautiful in a harsh desert way. Rocky hills rose up on both sides of the road, covered with scattered bushes and small trees. The sky was clear blue without a single cloud. In the distance, Maria could see snow-covered mountains that looked peaceful and majestic. It was hard to believe that such a pretty place could be dangerous. Mike was telling her about his daughter back home in Dallas. The little girl had just turned 6 years old and was starting to play soccer. Mike had missed her birthday because of his deployment, but his wife had sent pictures of the party. He showed Maria photos on his phone of a smiling girl with pigtails kicking a soccer ball in their backyard. Maria smiled looking at the pictures. It reminded her why they were all here serving their country, so families like Mike's could live safely at home. The radio crackled with routine communications between the vehicles. The lead truck reported that the road ahead looked clear. No unusual activity or signs of trouble. The convoy was making good time and would reach the mountain outpost right on schedule. Everything was going according to plan, just like all the previous trips through this valley. Maria checked her equipment one more time. The main radio was working perfectly with strong signal strength to the base. Her backup handheld radio was clipped securely to her belt. The emergency beacon was ready if she ever needed to call for immediate help. She had extra batteries in her pack and backup communication devices stored in a metal case behind her seat. They entered the narrow mountain pass where rocky ridges rose up steeply on both sides of the road. This was always the most beautiful part of the journey. The road wound between tall stone formations that had been carved by wind and water over thousands of years. Maria had driven through here so many times that she knew every curve and hill along the way. Mike was still talking about his daughter when the first explosion shattered the peaceful morning. The blast came from somewhere ahead of them near the lead vehicle. The sound was incredibly loud, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Maria felt the shockwave hit their truck and saw a huge column of black smoke rising into the clear sky. Before anyone could react, a second explosion erupted even closer to their position. Then a third blast shook the ground beneath them. Mike yanked the steering wheel hard to the left, trying to get their truck behind a large boulder for protection. Maria grabbed the radio handset and tried to contact the base, but enemy gunfire erupted from the hills around them. Before she could speak, bullets began hitting their truck from multiple directions. The sound was like deadly hail pounding on the armored sides and windows. Maria could see muzzle flashes sparkling from hidden positions in the rocks above them. Enemy fighters had set up a perfect ambush in the narrow pass where the convoy had no room to maneuver or escape. Mike was shouting something, but Maria could not hear him over the noise of gunfire. She tried to call for help on the radio, but the sounds of battle were too loud. More explosions erupted around them as rocket-propelled grenades struck the convoy vehicles. The smell of smoke and burning fuel filled the air, making it hard to breathe. Maria saw soldiers from the other trucks jumping out and taking cover behind rocks and disabled vehicles. They were firing back at the enemy positions, but the attackers had the advantage of high ground and prepared fighting positions. Bullets were flying everywhere as both sides fought desperately in the narrow canyon. That was when the rocket hit their truck directly. Maria saw a bright flash and felt herself flying through the air. Time seemed to slow down as she spun helplessly through space. She could see pieces of their destroyed vehicle tumbling around her. The world went completely silent, as if someone had turned off all sound. Then everything went black as she hit the rocky ground hard. When Maria opened her eyes, thick black smoke was everywhere, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Her ears were ringing so loudly that she could not hear anything else. She tried to call out but could not even hear her own voice. The ringing sound was overwhelming, like a fire alarm going off inside her head. She tried to stand up, but something was terribly wrong with her body. Looking down through the smoke, Maria saw her legs twisted at angles that made no sense. Both legs were clearly broken below the knees, with bones sticking out through torn fabric and flesh. Blood was pooling on the ground around her, creating dark stains on the rocky surface. The pain hit her like a bolt of lightning shooting through her entire body. She screamed, but still could not hear her own voice because of the ringing in her ears. The agony was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Every small movement sent waves of fire through her shattered legs, making her feel sick and dizzy. Through the smoke and dust, Maria could see other soldiers taking cover and returning fire at the enemy positions. Bullets were still flying back and forth as the battle continued around her. She could see muzzle flashes from both friendly and enemy weapons lighting up the smoky air like deadly fireworks. Mike, the driver, was lying motionless near the burning wreckage of their truck. Maria tried to call to him but got no response. Other soldiers were shouting to each other, but their voices sounded far away and distorted through the ringing in her damaged ears. The acrid smell of explosives and burning fuel made her cough and struggle to breathe. Maria realized with growing horror that she was badly wounded and unable to move. Her radio equipment was scattered somewhere in the wreckage. The convoy was under heavy attack from a well-planned ambush. Enemy fighters were positioned all around them with automatic weapons and rocket launchers. Her fellow soldiers were trapped in a deadly crossfire with limited ammunition and no way to escape. Without radio contact, they could not call for help or air support. The enemy had chosen their ambush site perfectly in a narrow canyon where rescue helicopters could not easily land. Maria understood that unless someone could reach a working radio and call for immediate assistance, all 40 soldiers in the convoy would be killed or captured within the next few minutes. Part 3, realizing the horrible truth, lay on the rocky ground trying to understand what had happened to her body. The ringing in her ears was slowly getting quieter, but everything still sounded muffled and strange. She could hear gunfire all around her, but it seemed far away, like sounds coming through thick walls. Her head felt dizzy and confused from hitting the ground so hard during the explosion. She tried to move her arms and was relieved that they still worked normally. Her hands could grip rocks and push against the ground. Her shoulders and back seemed to be okay despite the terrible fall from the destroyed truck. But when she tried to feel her legs, the horror of her situation became clear. She could not feel anything below her knees at all. The bones in both legs were completely shattered. Pieces of white bone were sticking out through bloody tears in her uniform pants. Her right leg was bent sideways at an impossible angle. Her left leg was twisted backwards in a way that made her stomach feel sick just looking at it. Dark red blood was spreading in a growing pool around her lower body. Maria tried to call out to her teammates for help, but her voice came out as a weak whisper. The explosion had damaged her hearing and probably hurt her throat from all the smoke she had breathed in. She could see other soldiers about 50 feet away, crouched behind rocks and pieces of destroyed vehicles. They were busy firing their weapons at enemy positions and did not notice her lying in the open. The enemy attack was much worse than she had first realized. Fighters with automatic weapons were shooting from hidden positions all along both sides of the narrow valley. They had set up this ambush very carefully, choosing a spot where the American convoy would be trapped, with no way to escape quickly. Rocket-propelled grenades were exploding constantly, sending deadly pieces of metal flying through the air. Maria could see that at least 3 soldiers from her unit were already dead. Their bodies lay motionless near the burning remains of the lead truck. Several other soldiers appeared to be wounded, but were still fighting back against the enemy attack. Bloodstains on rocks and equipment showed that more people had been hurt in the initial explosions and gunfire. Johnny Martinez was crouched behind a large boulder about 30 feet away from Maria. She could see him firing his rifle at targets up in the hills. His face was covered with dirt and smoke, but he looked determined to keep fighting. Every few seconds he would duck down as enemy bullets hit the rock he was using for protection. Chips of stone flew off the boulder each time it was hit. Tommy Chen, the youngest soldier in their unit, was trapped behind the wreckage of the second truck. Maria could see that he was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but he was still alive and fighting. He looked scared and was probably wishing he was back home with his family instead of in this terrible battle. But he kept shooting at the enemy positions like the brave soldier he had become. The radio equipment that Maria desperately needed was scattered around the destroyed third truck. She could see pieces of her communication gear lying in the dirt about 30 yards away from where she lay helpless. The main radio unit had been thrown clear of the explosion and might still be working. Its metal case looked dented but not completely destroyed. Between Maria and her radio equipment was completely open ground with no rocks or vehicles to provide cover from enemy fire. She could see dirt kicking up all around that area as bullets hit the ground. Any soldier who tried to run across that space would be shot immediately by the enemy. Fighters positioned in the hills above. Maria realized with growing panic that she was the only person who could operate the advanced radio systems needed to call for help. The other soldiers knew basic communication procedures, but she was the expert who knew all the emergency frequencies and call signs for air support. Without her knowledge and skills, the convoy could not contact rescue helicopters or fighter jets. The enemy fire was getting more accurate as the fighters adjusted their aim. Maria could hear bullets whistling very close to her head. Pieces of rock were hitting her face as shots struck the ground nearby. The enemy had spotted her lying in the open and were trying to finish her off. She pressed her face against the dirt and tried to make herself as small as possible. Lieutenant Johnson was shouting orders to his soldiers, but Maria could barely hear him through the constant noise of gunfire. She could see him waving his arms, trying to coordinate their defense against the well-planned enemy attack. But his men were running low on ammunition and had no way to call for backup without working radio equipment. Maria looked at her shattered legs again and felt a wave of despair wash over her. The pain was getting worse as shock wore off and her body began to fully realize the extent of her injuries. She was losing a lot of blood and starting to feel weak and lightheaded. Moving even a few inches caused terrible agony to shoot through her entire lower body. The distance to her radio looked impossible to cross. 30 yards might as well have been 30 miles given her condition. She could only use her arms to drag her broken body across rough, rocky ground, while enemy snipers tried to kill her. The task seemed completely hopeless and insane to even consider attempting. But as Maria watched her fellow soldiers fighting desperately against overwhelming odds, she understood that she was their only hope for survival. Johnny Martinez, who always talked about his wife back home. Tommy Chen, who was barely old enough to vote but was fighting like a veteran. Lieutenant Johnson, who trusted her completely to handle all radio communications. All 40 soldiers in the convoy were depending on her to save their lives. The enemy fighters were moving closer to the trapped Americans. Maria could see them advancing from position to position in the hills above. They were surrounding the convoy and would soon be close enough to throw grenades down at the soldiers hiding behind rocks. Within minutes, the enemy would have clear shots at everyone and the battle would be over. Maria stared at her radio equipment lying in that deadly open space. She knew that reaching it would require crawling 30 yards across ground, where enemy snipers were waiting to shoot anyone who moved. With both legs completely useless, she would have to pull her entire body weight using only her arms while bleeding heavily and fighting through incredible pain. The odds of surviving such an attempt were very small. But the odds of all 40 soldiers surviving without radio contact were exactly 0. Maria took a deep, shuddering breath and began to prepare herself for the most difficult and important journey of her entire life. She had to reach that radio or everyone would die, including herself. Maria pressed her palms flat against the rough, rocky ground and took the deepest breath of her life. She knew that once she started moving, there would be no turning back. The enemy fighters in the hills above were watching for any movement. The moment she began crawling toward her radio equipment, they would try to kill her. She looked one more time at the 30 yards of open ground between her and the scattered communication gear. The main radio unit was lying on its side near a piece of twisted metal from their destroyed truck. She could see its green power light still blinking, which meant it might still be working. That small green light represented the only hope for 40 soldiers trapped in this deadly ambush. The ground between Maria and the radio was covered with sharp rocks and pieces of hot metal from the explosions. There was no cover at all, just flat open space where enemy snipers would have perfect shots at her. Bullet holes in the dirt showed where the fighters had been testing their aim. They were ready for her. Maria dug her fingernails into the rocky soil and pulled her body forward 6 inches. The pain from her shattered legs was immediate and overwhelming. It felt like someone was driving red-hot knives through her bones. She had to bite down on her lip to keep from screaming out loud. The taste of blood filled her mouth as she struggled, not to make any noise that would give away her position. Moving her useless legs was the hardest part. She had to drag the dead weight behind her while trying to keep the broken bones from catching on rocks or pieces of metal. Every small bump sent waves of agony shooting through her entire body. Her uniform pants were already soaked with blood and getting worse with each movement. After crawling only 2 feet, Maria had to stop and rest. She was breathing hard and sweating despite the cool morning air. Her arms were already getting tired from pulling her full body weight. She realized this was going to take much longer than she had hoped. The enemy fighters would have plenty of time to spot her and take careful aim. A bullet whizzed past her head so close she could feel the wind from it. The enemy had seen her moving and were adjusting their fire. Maria pressed her face into the dirt and tried to become invisible. More shots hit the ground around her, kicking up small clouds of dust and rock chips. She waited until the shooting stopped, then continued crawling forward. The next few feet were even harder. Sharp stones cut into her arms and chest as she dragged herself across the rough terrain. Her uniform was getting torn and dirty. Blood from her legs was leaving a clear trail behind her that the enemy could follow. But she kept moving forward, inch by painful inch toward the radio that could save everyone. Johnny Martinez saw what Maria was doing and tried to provide covering fire. He leaned out from behind his protective boulder and shot at the enemy positions in the hills. Other soldiers joined in, creating enough noise and confusion to distract some of the enemy fighters. But there were too many attackers, and they quickly focused their attention back on the crawling figure in the open. Maria had covered about 8 feet when a rocket-propelled grenade exploded 20 yards to her left. The blast knocked her flat and filled her mouth with dirt and smoke. Her ears started ringing again, and she felt dizzy from the shockwave. For a moment she thought about giving up. The pain was unbearable and she was losing too much blood. It would be so easy to just lie there and let everything end. But then she heard Tommy Chen crying out for help. The young soldier had been hit by shrapnel from the explosion and was bleeding badly. He was calling for his mother, just like Maria knew she would if she was dying far from home. That sound gave her the strength to keep going. These were her people, her family, and she could not let them die. Maria continued crawling forward using a technique she remembered from basic training. She would pull herself ahead with her arms, then rest for a few seconds, then move again. The key was to time her movements between bursts of enemy fire. When she heard guns shooting, she would freeze and wait. When there was a pause, she would advance as quickly as possible. The halfway point felt like a major victory. Maria had crawled 15 yards across the deadly open ground and was still alive. Her radio equipment was getting closer, but the distance still seemed impossible. Her arms were cramping badly and she was having trouble gripping the rocks. Blood loss was making her feel weak and confused. Sometimes she forgot where she was or why she was crawling. Enemy fire was getting more accurate, as the fighters realized what she was trying to do. They understood that if she reached the radio, she could call for air support that would destroy their carefully planned ambush. Bullets were hitting very close to her now. One shot grazed her shoulder, leaving a burning scratch across her back. Another bullet hit a rock right next to her head, sending sharp stone fragments into her face. Maria could see her teammates watching her progress with amazement and fear. They wanted to help, but any soldier who left cover would be shot immediately. Lieutenant Johnson was shouting something at her, but she could not hear the words over the constant gunfire. She could see the concern and admiration in his eyes as he watched her incredible effort. The radio was getting closer, but Maria was getting weaker. She had been crawling for almost 10 minutes and had lost a dangerous amount of blood. Her vision was starting to blur and she felt cold despite the warm desert sun. Her body was going into shock from the severe injuries and blood loss. She knew she did not have much time left. With 15 more yards to go, Maria summoned every bit of strength and willpower she had left. She thought about her family back home, who were counting on her to come back safely. She thought about Johnny's wife and baby daughter who needed him to survive this battle. She thought about Tommy's parents who would be destroyed if their young son died in this foreign desert. Maria dug her fingernails deep into the rocky ground and pulled herself forward again. Each movement was agony, but she refused to stop. The green light on her radio was calling to her like a beacon of hope. She just had to reach it and everything would be okay. Help would come and her soldiers would go home to their families. The crawl continued across the deadly ground as enemy. Bullets searched for their target and Maria Santos fought through pain and blood loss to save 40 lives. Maria pressed her palms flat against the rough rocky ground and took the deepest breath of her life. She knew that once she started moving, there would be no turning back. The enemy fighters in the hills above were watching for any movement. The moment she began crawling toward her radio equipment, they would try to kill her. She looked one more time at the 30 yards of open ground between her and the scattered communication gear. The main radio unit was lying on its side near a piece of twisted metal from their destroyed truck. She could see its green power light still blinking, which meant it might still be working. That small green light represented the only hope for 40 soldiers trapped in this deadly ambush. The ground between Maria and the radio was covered with sharp rocks and pieces of hot metal from the explosions. There was no cover at all, just flat open space where enemy snipers would have perfect shots at her. Bullet holes in the dirt showed where the fighters had been testing their aim. They were ready for her. Maria dug her fingernails into the rocky soil and pulled her body forward 6 inches. The pain from her shattered legs was immediate and overwhelming. It felt like someone was driving red-hot knives through her bones. She had to bite down on her lip to keep from screaming out loud. The taste of blood filled her mouth as she struggled not to make any noise that would give away her position. Moving her useless legs was the hardest part. She had to drag the dead weight behind her while trying to keep the broken bones from catching on rocks or pieces of metal. Every small bump sent waves of agony shooting through her entire body. Her uniform pants were already soaked with blood and getting worse with each movement. After crawling only 2 feet, Maria had to stop and rest. She was breathing hard and sweating despite the cool morning air. Her arms were already getting tired from pulling her full body weight. She realized this was going to take much longer than she had hoped. The enemy fighters would have plenty of time to spot her and take careful aim. A bullet whizzed past her head so close she could feel the wind from it. The enemy had seen her moving and were adjusting their fire. Maria pressed her face into the dirt and tried to become invisible. More shots hit the ground around her, kicking up small clouds of dust and rock chips. She waited until the shooting stopped, then continued crawling forward. The next few feet were even harder. Sharp stones cut into her arms and chest as she dragged herself across the rough terrain. Her uniform was getting torn and dirty. Blood from her legs was leaving a clear trail behind her that the enemy could follow. But she kept moving forward inch by painful inch toward the radio that could save everyone. Johnny Martinez saw what Maria was doing and tried to provide covering fire. He leaned out from behind his protective boulder and shot at the enemy positions in the hills. Other soldiers joined in creating enough noise and confusion to distract some of the enemy fighters. But there were too many attackers, and they quickly focused their attention back on the crawling figure in the open. Maria had covered about 8 feet when a rocket-propelled grenade exploded 20 yards to her left. The blast knocked her flat and filled her mouth with dirt and smoke. Her ears started ringing again and she felt dizzy from the shock wave. For a moment she thought about giving up. The pain was unbearable and she was losing too much blood. It would be so easy to just lie there and let everything end. But then she heard Tommy Chen crying out for help. The young soldier had been hit by shrapnel from the explosion and was bleeding badly. He was calling for his mother just like Maria knew she would if she was dying far from home. That sound gave her the strength to keep going. These were her people, her family, and she could not let them die. Maria continued crawling forward using a technique she remembered from basic training. She would pull herself ahead with her arms, then rest for a few seconds, then move again. The key was to time her movements between bursts of enemy fire. When she heard guns shooting, she would freeze and wait. When there was a pause, she would advance as quickly as possible. The halfway point felt like a major victory. Maria had crawled 15 yards across the deadly open ground and was still alive. Her radio equipment was getting closer, but the distance still seemed impossible. Her arms were cramping badly and she was having trouble gripping the rocks. Blood loss was making her feel weak and confused. Sometimes she forgot where she was or why she was crawling. Enemy fire was getting more accurate as the fighters realized what she was trying to do. They understood that if she reached the radio, she could call for air support that would destroy their carefully planned ambush. Bullets were hitting very close to her now. One shot grazed her shoulder, leaving a burning scratch across her back. Another bullet hit a rock right next to her head, sending sharp stone fragments into her face. Maria could see her teammates watching her progress with amazement and fear. They wanted to help, but any soldier who left cover would be shot immediately. Lieutenant Johnson was shouting something at her, but she could not hear the words over the constant gunfire. She could see the concern and admiration in his eyes as he watched her incredible effort. The radio was getting closer, but Maria was getting weaker. She had been crawling for almost 10 minutes and had lost a dangerous amount of blood. Her vision was starting to blur and she felt cold despite the warm desert sun. Her body was going into shock from the severe injuries and blood loss. She knew she did not have much time left. With 15 more yards to go, Maria summoned every bit of strength and willpower she had left. She thought about her family back home who were counting on her to come back safely. She thought about Johnny's wife and baby daughter who needed him to survive this battle. She thought about Tommy's parents who would be destroyed if their young son died in this foreign desert. Maria dug her fingernails deep into the rocky ground and pulled herself forward again. Each movement was agony, but she refused to stop. The green light on her radio was calling to her like a beacon of hope. She just had to reach it and everything would be okay. Help would come and her soldiers would go home to their families. The crawl continued across the deadly ground as enemy bullets searched for their target and Maria Santos fought through, pain and blood loss to save 40 lives. Maria's bloody hand closed around the radio handset with a grip that felt like holding on to life itself. After crawling 30 yards through enemy gunfire with both legs shattered, she had finally reached the communication equipment that could save 40 soldiers. But touching the radio was only the first step. Now she had to make it work while bullets continued to fly around her. Her vision was blurry from blood loss and her hands were shaking badly. She could barely see the buttons and switches on the radio control panel. Everything looked fuzzy and out of focus, like she was looking through dirty water. Maria wiped blood and dirt from her eyes and tried to concentrate on the familiar equipment she had used hundreds of times before. The main power switch was in the on position, which was good news. The green light was still blinking steadily, showing that the radio had battery power and was ready to transmit. Maria checked the antenna connection and saw that it was still properly attached despite being thrown around in the explosion. The metal case had several dents and scratches, but the important parts seemed to be undamaged. She turned the frequency dial to the emergency channel used for calling air support. Her fingers were slippery with blood and kept slipping off the small knobs and switches. It took 3 tries to get the frequency set correctly. Maria had memorized all the emergency radio procedures during her training, but now her mind felt cloudy and confused from the severe injuries. The handset felt incredibly heavy in her weak hands. She brought it close to her mouth and pressed the transmit button. Her voice came out as barely a whisper because her throat was dry and damaged from breathing smoke and dust during the battle. She tried to speak louder but could only manage a weak, croaking sound. Maria cleared her throat and tried again. This time her voice was stronger and clearer. She spoke the emergency code words that would get immediate attention from any aircraft in the area. Her radio call went out over the airwaves, carrying a desperate plea for help across the desert mountains. The response came back almost immediately. A calm professional voice crackled through the radio speaker. It was the pilot of a fighter jet flying somewhere high above the valley. He had heard her emergency call and was ready to help. The sound of that friendly voice gave Maria hope that rescue was finally coming for her trapped soldiers. The pilot identified himself as Captain Williams, flying an F-16 fighter jet loaded with bombs and missiles. He had been on a routine patrol mission when he heard Maria's desperate call for help. There were actually 2 fighter jets in his flight, both ready to attack enemy positions. But first they needed detailed information about the situation on the ground. Maria gave their exact location using coordinates she remembered from the morning briefing. She described how many soldiers were trapped and how they were positioned behind rocks and destroyed vehicles. Her voice was getting weaker, but she forced herself to speak clearly so the pilot could understand every important detail. The pilot asked about enemy positions, and this was where Maria's unique location became crucial. While her fellow soldiers were pinned down behind cover, she was lying in the open with a clear view of the entire battlefield. She could see exactly where the enemy fighters were hiding in the rocky hills above the convoy. Maria counted at least 20 enemy positions spread along both sides of the narrow valley. She could see muzzle flashes from their weapons and movement as they shifted between different hiding spots. The attackers had machine guns and rocket launchers positioned to create deadly crossfire zones. They were well organized and had obviously planned this ambush very carefully. But there was a serious problem with calling in airstrikes. The enemy fighters were positioned very close to the trapped American soldiers. Some of the enemy positions were only 50 yards away from where Johnny Martinez and other soldiers were taking cover. A bomb or missile that missed its target by even a small amount could kill friendly troops instead of enemies. Captain Williams explained the danger over the radio. His weapons were very powerful and could easily destroy enemy positions, but he needed someone to guide the attacks with perfect accuracy. The person calling in airstrikes had to be able to see both friendly and enemy positions clearly. They also needed to mark targets precisely so the bombs would hit exactly the right spots. Maria realized that she was the only person who could do this job. Her teammates were all pinned down behind cover and could not see the entire battlefield. But from her position lying in the open, she had a perfect view of everything. She could see where every enemy fighter was hiding and exactly where her fellow soldiers were taking cover. The responsibility was enormous. If she made a mistake in calling in the airstrikes, she could cause the fighter jets to bomb their own soldiers. But if she did nothing, the enemy would continue their attack and eventually kill everyone in the convoy. There was no choice except to guide the fighter jets with perfect precision while lying wounded in the middle of the battlefield. Captain Williams asked if she was ready to direct the airstrikes. Maria looked around at her fellow soldiers who were still fighting desperately against overwhelming odds. Johnny Martinez was down to his last ammunition magazine. Tommy Chen was bleeding from multiple wounds but still returning fire. Lieutenant Johnson was trying to coordinate their defense, but his men were running out of bullets and hope. The enemy fighters were getting bolder and moving closer to the trapped Americans. Maria could see them advancing from position to position in the hills above. They were surrounding the convoy and would soon be close enough to finish off the remaining soldiers with grenades and automatic weapons. Within minutes, the battle would be over unless help arrived. Maria pressed the radio transmit button and spoke in the strongest voice she could manage. She told Captain Williams that she was ready to guide his airstrikes. She had clear visual contact with all enemy positions and could mark targets for immediate attack. Her voice was steady and professional despite the terrible pain from her shattered legs and the blood loss that was making her feel weak and dizzy. The fighter pilot confirmed that he was beginning his attack run. Maria Santos was about to direct the most important airstrike of her military career, while lying wounded and bleeding on a rocky battlefield, 30 yards from the nearest cover. Maria gripped the radio handset tightly and focused all her remaining strength on the most important conversation of her life. Captain Williams was circling high above in his F-16 fighter jet, waiting for her to guide his bombs onto enemy positions. She could hear the distant sound of jet engines as the aircraft prepared for their attack runs. Everything depended on her ability to mark targets with perfect accuracy. She studied the hillsides around the trapped convoy and identified the most dangerous enemy positions first. There was a machine gun nest about 200 yards up the slope on the left side of the valley. The gunners there had been shooting down at Johnny Martinez and his group for the past 20 minutes. Maria could see their muzzle flashes clearly from her position in the open. Speaking into the radio, Maria gave Captain Williams the exact coordinates of the machine gun position. She described landmarks he could see from the air like large rocks and dead trees that would help him identify the target. Her voice was calm and professional, even though she was bleeding heavily and fighting to stay conscious from her severe injuries. The first bomb hit perfectly. Maria watched the explosion destroy the enemy machine gun nest in a ball of fire and smoke. The blast echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. Pieces of rock and metal flew high into the air before raining down on the hillside. The enemy gunners who had been shooting at her teammates were gone, but there were many more targets to destroy. Maria quickly identified the next most dangerous position. A group of enemy fighters with rocket launchers was hidden behind a cluster of boulders on the right side of the valley. They had been firing rockets at the American vehicles and were preparing to launch more attacks. She gave Captain Williams new coordinates for the rocket team. The pilot confirmed he could see the target area and was beginning his attack run. Maria watched the fighter jet streak across the sky, leaving a white trail behind it. The bomb hit exactly where she had directed, completely destroying the enemy rocket position. One by one, Maria guided the airstrikes onto each enemy fighting position. Her directions were so accurate that every bomb hit its target perfectly. Enemy fighters who had been shooting at the trapped convoy were eliminated systematically. The carefully planned ambush was being destroyed by precise air power directed by a wounded soldier lying in the dirt. Some enemy fighters tried to escape by running to new positions, but Maria could see their movements clearly. She called out their locations to Captain Williams, who used his aircraft's machine guns to stop them. The fighter jets swept back and forth across the valley, hunting down any remaining attackers. After 15 minutes of airstrikes, the shooting from enemy positions had stopped completely. The hillsides that had been filled with muzzle flashes and explosions were now quiet and still. Smoke was rising from multiple destroyed positions where enemy fighters had been hiding. The ambush had been completely broken. Captain Williams reported that he could see no more enemy activity in the valley. All hostile positions had been eliminated, and the immediate threat was over. He was calling for medical evacuation helicopters to come and rescue the wounded soldiers. Help was finally on the way for the trapped convoy. Maria let the radio handset fall from her weak fingers. She had done it. She had crawled 30 yards with both legs shattered and directed airstrikes that saved 40 soldiers. But the effort had cost her almost everything. She was barely conscious and had lost a dangerous amount of blood from her terrible injuries. Johnny Martinez was the first soldier to reach her. He ran across the open ground that Maria had crawled so painfully and knelt beside her broken body. Tears were streaming down his face as he saw the extent of her injuries. He pressed bandages against her wounds and tried to stop the bleeding while talking to her in a gentle voice. Other soldiers quickly joined him. Tommy Chen brought the medical kit and started treating her shattered legs. Lieutenant Johnson called for the medics and coordinated her emergency care. Everyone understood that Maria had saved all their lives through an act of incredible courage and determination. The rescue helicopters arrived 20 minutes later. Military medics rushed to Maria with advanced medical equipment and immediately began working to stabilize her condition. They gave her blood transfusions and strong pain medication while preparing her for emergency transport to the nearest field hospital. As the helicopter lifted off from the valley floor, Maria looked down at her fellow soldiers who were waving at her from the ground. Every single one of them was alive because of her heroic crawl across that deadly battlefield. Johnny Martinez was holding up a picture of his baby daughter. Tommy Chen was giving her a thumbs-up signal. Lieutenant Johnson was saluting her with tears in his eyes. The medical team worked frantically during the helicopter flight to keep Maria alive. Her injuries were severe, and she had lost massive amounts of blood. Both legs would need to be amputated, but the doctors were confident they could save her life. She drifted in and out of consciousness as the aircraft raced toward the hospital. 3 months later, Maria woke up in a clean hospital room in Germany. Her legs were gone, but she was alive and surrounded by cards and flowers from grateful soldiers. The 40 men she had saved had all written letters thanking her for their lives. Many had visited her during her long recovery, bringing pictures of their families and stories from home. Johnny Martinez brought his wife and new baby daughter to meet the woman who had saved the child's father. The little girl was named Maria in honor of the soldier who had crawled through hell to make sure Daddy came home. Tommy Chen brought his parents, who hugged Maria and called her their second daughter. Maria received the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration, for her incredible act of heroism. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, including all 40 soldiers from the convoy. But she always said the real reward was seeing those men go home safely to their families. Today, Maria works with wounded veterans, showing them that losing limbs does not mean losing hope or purpose. She travels around the country speaking at schools and military bases about courage and sacrifice. Her story inspires thousands of people to never give up when facing impossible challenges. The radio that Maria crawled 30 yards to reach is now displayed in a military museum. A plaque beside it tells the story of Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, who shattered both legs in an enemy ambush, but crawled 200 meters across open ground under fire to call in airstrikes that saved 40 soldiers. Her heroic actions prove that one person's courage and determination can change everything.